Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
We have a 3-minute YouTube video with the highlights of President Trump's speech to the Boy Scout Jamboree. So we'll run that now, and then will speak to us. Oh, you Boy Scouts, you know life, you know life.
19th Boy Scout Jamboree, wow. And to address such a tremendous group, boy, you have a lot of people here. The press will say it's about 200 people. It looks like about 45,000 people. You set a record today. You know, I go to Washington and I see all these politicians. And I see the swamp. And it's not a good place. In fact, today I said we ought to change it from the word swamp to the word cesspool, or perhaps to the word sewer. As the Scout law says, a Scout is trustworthy, loyal. We could use some more loyalty, I will tell you that. By the way, what do you think the chances are that this incredible, massive crowd, record-setting, is going to be shown on television tonight? 1% or 0? President Trump spoke before a small crowd of Boy Scouts today. That is some crowd. Fake media, fake news. By the way, just a question. Did President Obama ever come to a jamboree? And we'll be back. We'll be back. The answer is no, but we'll be back. Sold his company for a tremendous amount of money. And he went out and bought a big yacht. And he had a very interesting life. I won't go any more than that because you're Boy Scouts, so I'm not going to tell you what he did. Should I tell you? Should I tell you? Oh, you're Boy Scouts, but you know life. You know life. He got bored with this life of yachts and sailing and all of the things he did in the south of France and other places. You won't get bored, right? You know, truthfully, your workers, you'll get bored too, believe me. Of course, having a few good years like that isn't so bad. Do you remember that famous night on television, November 8th, where they said, these dishonest people, where they said, there is no path to victory for Donald Trump. And you know, we have a tremendous disadvantage in the Electoral College. Popular vote is much easier. And by the way, under the Trump administration, you'll be saying Merry Christmas again when you go shopping, believe me. Merry Christmas. They've been downplaying that little beautiful phrase. You're going to be saying Merry Christmas again, folks.
Well, good afternoon and Merry Christmas to all of you.
Yeah, thank you.
Back in July, when I first saw President Trump's remarks to the Boy Scout National Jamboree, I was at the beach with my family down in North Carolina. It was getting to be late in the evening and it was dark outside. Nevertheless, I was a bit agitated, so I decided to walk down to the ocean. I had no intention of really doing anything other than to get my mind off of what I had just heard, but instead I started stewing over it more and more, and eventually thoughts and phrases started bubbling up into my head. So I did what any card-carrying millennial would do. I whipped out my phone and started a voice memo. And here I was among, admittedly, the motley crowd that congregates at the beach late at night, wandering up and down, cathartically venting about, you know, what a perversion of the values of the Boy Scouts of America, an organization that has single-handedly had a greater impact on me than almost any other I just heard. Probably an hour later, after at least one concerned text message from my mother wondering where I was, I felt a little better, and I decided to head back to where we were staying. On my way, it occurred to me that maybe a few people might be interested in what I had to say, so I emailed Suzanne Cassidy, the opinion editor of LNP, and asked if she would have any interest in running an opinion piece written by an Eagle Scout on the Jamboree. And within minutes, she said that would be great. So I set to work essentially refining those initial voice memo ramblings into complete sentences. And ultimately, when I finally sent it in, I had little idea what was going to happen next. The Boy Scout motto, as you may be aware, is to be prepared, and I thought I was prepared for the inevitable cranky comment or two that might appear online. Well, in the first few days of the article running online, it was read by more than 1 million people, becoming the most viewed article ever on Lancaster Online, and there were more than 1,100 comments posted, and I'm ashamed to say that I read most all of them, and it was shared tens of thousands of times on Facebook. Later, I got an email from a producer at CNN wondering if I'd be interested in coming on their show at 6:30 on Sunday morning, and I said, sure, 6:30 on Sunday morning is when I'm the most awake. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the idea. A day or two later, it dawned on me that over the course of less than a week, my personal mutterings had been read around the world by more than 1 million people, and I'd been on national TV to discuss them. This is what it must be like to be a cable TV host. That's not my career aspiration. I'll just get that out of the way. In any case, clearly what I wrote struck a chord with a good number of people. It was gratifying to know that I was not alone in taking offense at the idea that a gathering of the Boy Scouts, an explicitly apolitical organization, had essentially been turned into a campaign rally, and that at least some scouts and leaders in attendance had egged the president on. The more I thought about this, the more I came to realize that this didn't happen in a vacuum, and it is some of what I believe the root causes of this to be that I'd like to discuss this afternoon. Before I get too far, and I'm just curious, are there any other Eagle Scouts in the room? Some good company. Anyway, by way of personal introduction, I joined Cub Scouts when I was in first grade in the fall of 2004 as part of Pack 19 in Strasburg. And I joined Boy Scouts in the spring of 2009 as part of Troop 56, also in Strasburg. Some highlights of my scouting experience include a high-adventure sailing trip in the Chesapeake, during which a friend who was a partner in crime throughout scouting as a wave was crashing over the side of the boat yelled, "I thought sailing was for retired people." A 10-day backpacking trip at Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, during which, among a multi-year drought, it rained on all but 2 of the days. I had some great weather experiences, and serving 2 terms as my troop's senior patrol leader, or scout in charge of making sure the leaders don't have to get up. That's actually not fair to say at all. I had some fantastic adult leaders throughout my time in Scouts who shaped my perspective on the world around me and taught me more about the outdoors and leadership and how to clean up an entire kitchen using only a single paper towel than I ever could have imagined. After completing a resurfacing part of the playground at the daycare center in Strasburg that I had once attended as my Eagle project, I earned my Eagle Scout Award on my 17th birthday in 2015, and prior to aging out, I earned a few more merit badges to get a bronze palm. Through scouting, I came to appreciate the value of teamwork and friendship despite my natural introversion. I came to enjoy the outdoors despite my father once saying that his idea of camping was a hotel without room service. And I came to appreciate the 12 points of the Scout Law: trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent as guiding principles by which to lead life. In a lot of ways, I think they're quite similar to the Rotary 4-way test. When I spoke with Dr. Gemmel and Mr. Otto about what to talk about today, in addition to sharing some of my experiences in scouting, they asked me to share some observations on our current state of affairs. And in a lot of ways, they aren't good. As we know, there are more than 28 million Americans who still don't have health insurance, yet Americans spend more than $3.2 trillion on health care costs each year. People of color in America are more likely to reside in a jail cell than a college dorm room. America's national debt now exceeds 100% of its GDP, coming in at more than $20.6 trillion. Pew Research polling suggests that Americans have become more polarized in their political views over the past several decades, and that gap continues to widen. Opioid addiction caused more than 30,000 deaths in 2015 and cost more than $78 billion. Closer to home, we know that from the year I began kindergarten to the year I graduated Lampeter-Strasburg High School, the percentage of students eligible for free and reduced lunches increased from 10% to 27%. The latter figure was the best in the county as of 2016. More than 1 in 4 students live at less than 185% of the federal poverty level, even in a relatively well-off school district in the area. And as you heard 2 weeks ago from Phil Wenger at the County Conservancy, the population of Lancaster County is expected to grow by 140,000 people over the next 23 years, and we're not yet prepared to handle that from a policy perspective. And while none of these are perfect indicators of the great challenges facing our country and our community, and admittedly, at any time in our history, one could probably find an equally disturbing litany of statistics on a variety of complicated policy issues, what makes this point in time different, I fear, is that we seem to lack the capacity to have a reasonable conversation on these issues that could lead to a reasonable solution, at least at the national level. Moreover, when the President of the United States gets up and announces to the Boy Scouts that we need to dismantle this horrible thing known as Obamacare, and a USA chant ensues, that exacerbates the division and disingenuousness that, in many ways, I believe, pollutes our politics. The President, as I wrote, had a unique opportunity to celebrate the values that guide scouting, which are values that could guide our country in a lot of ways: servant leadership and teamwork and community service. A couple of weeks ago, Mayor Rick Gray mentioned to you Ronald Reagan's quote about how much you can get done when you don't worry about who gets the credit. And that applies as much to scouting as to anything else. A true crisis facing our country now is what I call a crisis of punditry. We read and hear about the political winners and losers of a situation more than the actual winners and losers. And democracy, in a lot of ways, has been reduced to a spectator sport. We cheer on our team and we boo the other team like we're a Philadelphia Eagles game. By the way, it's nice that the Eagles are finally something to cheer about. But anyway, my message today ultimately is one about engagement. We cannot let democracy be reduced to a combat sport where the arena of competition is cable news or Twitter or the Boy Scout Jamboree, and we simply cheer on our team and hope for the imminent demise of the opposition. I just finished reading a book earlier this week called Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of American Community, which was written in 2000 by a Harvard professor named Robert Putnam. If you're unfamiliar with the book, the central premise is that over the past several decades, we've seen a steady decline in what Putnam calls social capital, meaning the inherent value found in communities and social networks. The idea being that our lives are made more productive by having strong social ties with those around us. Putnam measures this decline through various windows of public opinion data that suggest fewer Americans, just 8% in the 1996 survey, believe that the honesty and integrity of the average American is improving, and 50% said it was getting worse. That 80% of Americans thought people had become less civil over the preceding 10 years, and that 2/3 of Americans said America's civil life had weakened in recent years, and that social and moral values were similarly on the decline, just as 80% said there should be more emphasis on community, even if that increased the demands placed on individuals. While I should note this data is 15 or 20 years old, more recent data generally seems to confirm the underlying trends discussed, and in a follow-up article published a few years ago, Putnam suggested that while there was some evidence to suggest that certain privileged groups had a mild resurgence in community engagement after 9/11, the gap is widening, particularly among working-class Americans. Putnam summarized the central premise of his study early in the book, quote, "For the first 2/3 of the 20th century, a powerful tide bore Americans into ever deeper engagement in the life of their communities. But a few decades ago, silently, without warning, that tide reversed and we were overtaken by a treacherous rip current. Without at first noticing, we have been pulled apart from one another and from our communities over the last third of the century. I can't help but wonder if the again people ostensibly long for when they say make America great again is in a time when communities were stronger and provided a non-governmental support system to help ameliorate or even acknowledge the gravity of the policy issues of the day. And while they don't necessarily use the term erosion of social capital to describe it, people feel the decline and they don't like it. In the political sphere, fewer Americans attend meetings on town or school affairs, are members of groups interested in better government, sign petitions, write Congress, write articles or letters to the editor, or make speeches than they did decades ago. 32 million fewer Americans were involved in community affairs as of 1994 than 20 years before. And a poll in 2014 found that less than a third of Americans write or call their elected officials even somewhat often. Only 30% express their views at least somewhat often in a newspaper, an online post, or by calling into a radio program. That only 20% of Americans volunteer on a political or issue campaign at least somewhat often, and that only 17% of Americans attend a political rally at least somewhat often. Of 10 activities that we probably would have learned in those Schoolhouse Rock videos that are bedrocks of participatory democracy, fewer than 1% of Americans participate in at least 8 out of 10 with any regularity. And of the political organizations of which people do claim to be members, increasingly the primary or even the sole manifestation of that membership is in writing a check. In other words, people are contributing money rather than time, and we're seeing the professionalization of issue advocacy. And often, even when national organizations do galvanize grassroots support, it's in getting a single person to take an individual action, such as calling their congressperson. These groups tend not to provide a connection among members in the same way that being a part of the Rotary or the Boy Scouts might do. Further, I mentioned earlier that I believe we're seeing a crisis of punditry. When people's primary interaction with politics is in watching TV and seeing political pundits argue about the politics of certain issues, it's no wonder they fall into that themselves. Moreover, we consume media that reinforces our own worldview. Try this sometime if you can stand it. Watch a half hour of Tucker Carlson or someone on Fox, and then flip over and watch a half hour of Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. You would think you're living in two entirely different countries. And on its own, that would not necessarily be an issue, except that television remains the primary vessel by which Americans get their news. Sociological research has shown that when people sort themselves into physical communities of homogeneous political interests, political and community engagement is actually reduced. It would seem to be a natural conclusion that the same effect transpires when we sort ourselves into ideologically similar TV viewing groups or online news reading groups. We become spectators rather than participants. In fact, Putnam found that being a frequent viewer of television is a strong predictor of disengagement with the community, that for each additional hour of television viewing each day was equated with a 10% reduction in civic activism, such as letter writing or attending public meetings. An author, James Howard Kunstler, said the outside world has become an abstraction filtered through TV, just as the weather is an abstraction filtered through air conditioning. Further, Putnam wrote, TV-based politics is to political action as watching ER or Grey's Anatomy or one of those shows now is to saving someone in distress. In correlation to the decline in formal participation in the political process, Americans spend less time engaged in informal social and community activities as well. Fewer Americans get together with their neighbors regularly, host dinner parties, or play cards. Various recent surveys suggest that about 30% of Americans don't know their neighbors by name, that only 20% of Americans regularly spend time with their neighbors, but that 2/3 of Americans would like to get to know their neighbors better. At the risk of stating the obvious, when Americans spend their evenings at home watching TV rather than at community meetings or in gatherings, it exacerbates that disengagement. Further, these decreasing interactions with neighbors means less time discussing community affairs or politics with others, which Putnam refers to as micro-deliberations. As such, when our interaction with the news comes in the form of a news program or a website that reinforces our worldview rather than a conversation with someone in public that might offer a different perspective, it's no wonder that we see increasing polarization and demonization of the other side and overall pessimism about our political system. And moreover, it's little wonder to me then how a candidate who unapologetically pits some Americans against others and is replete with entertaining bombast would appeal to a large swath of people who elected him to the nation's highest office. Now, admittedly, telling members of the Lancaster Rotary about the importance of community involvement and civic engagement might be a little bit like preaching to the choir, although sometimes I think the choir appreciates a good sermon too. In a world composed increasingly of spectators, it's you who are the doers and the joiners and the problem solvers. People who join organizations are more tolerant, less cynical, and more empathetic than those who don't. Joiners build the social capital that is so crucial to solving the problems before us, such as the litany of issues I mentioned earlier. I'm a big fan of this Teddy Roosevelt quote. He said, quote, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there's no great effort without error or shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." It was on the heels of America's last great deficit of social capital at the turn of the 20th century, after 3 decades of rapid technological advancement and a steady increase in crime, decrease in education levels, blight of cities, widening income gaps between the rich and the poor, and rampant political corruption, the time that historians refer to as the Gilded Age, that Americans made the investment in building social capital that has us sitting here right now. It was in 1905 that a handful of Chicago men from various walks of life first started meeting to build relationships and discuss issues facing their community. The Rotary, thus, was born. 5 years later, the Boy Scouts of America was founded, at least in part as a way to be a constructive activity for boys during their formative years. 110 years ago, a deficit in social capital galvanized the community organization that has lasted to this day. And despite what television and social media, and yes, the president's speech to the Boy Scouts and the ensuing reaction might suggest, I do see signs that our democracy remains fundamentally strong. Last winter, I had the opportunity to spend a week with Judge David Ashworth in the county courthouse, during which I saw a session of the drug court, as well as a jury trial from start to finish. And both of these, I believe, are examples of a democracy that works. In the former case, community leaders identified an area in which our policy was deficient and designed a policy solution that met the needs of each stakeholder and made the community better off. In the jury trial, I saw 12 people from various walks of life whom the court plucked from their daily lives, their jobs, families, hobbies. For 2 days, they sat in the courtroom and heard testimony on a subject with which they were probably unfamiliar at first. It was a case involving drug dealing. They had to weigh the law and use their common sense and life experiences to come to a fair verdict in a tough situation. They didn't use excuses to skirt their civic responsibilities. They didn't let a lack of prior knowledge impede acquiring their new understanding, and they worked together to complete the unenviable task before them, deciding on the guilt or innocence of a fellow citizen. That, too, is evidence of a democracy that works. Another example, and I'm not just saying this because you gave me a microphone and a free lunch, although I will say that will get you to come to a lot of places, is the Rotary. Each week you, the leaders of the community in which we live, gather to hear a perspective on an issue that may differ from your own. You talk with your neighbors about issues facing people, businesses, and organizations of Lancaster County, and you build relationships that are ultimately useful for solving problems. In other words, you build social capital. And it's vital to the future of American democracy that you keep at it. And now that I've patted you all on the back, if you don't mind, I'd take a second to pat the Boy Scouts of America on the back too. The word I typically use to encapsulate my experience in scouting is gratifying. It's gratifying that hundreds of volunteers and thousands of donors contribute time and money to build a program that prepares future leaders essentially by turning them loose in the outdoors. It's gratifying that my peers in scouting elected me to the office of senior patrol leader, and that after they'd done it once, they did it again, allowing me to further hone leadership skills that have proven useful in a variety of organizations beyond scouting. It is gratifying that a creed such as the Scout Law binds millions of people around the world to a common purpose, and that a slogan as simple as "do a good turn daily" can inspire so much community service and so many acts of kindness. You know, Putnam wrote, "What we need is not civic broccoli, good for you but unappealing, but an updated version of scouting's ingenious combination of values and fun." I would agree that scouting has an ingenious combination of values and fun, although I would push back on the notion that electronics-free wilderness team building as a way to build leadership skills or training and education and everything from first aid to citizenship needs to be updated. The BSA builds and sharpens the tools that will continue to build American democracy. So whether it's a trial by jury, the Rotary, the Boy Scouts of America, or any of the other innumerable worthwhile organizations I did not mention, these organizations and institutions shine a light on what our democracy should look like. Engagement with our communities, civil dialogue, a willingness to get into the arena, to get our hands dirty, to work together, to move forward for the good of all. That's what the Scout Law is about. That's what Rotary's four-way test is about. That's what America is about. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to quote one more president, although this is a fictional president. Josiah Bartlett in The West Wing said, quote, "Every time we think we've measured our capacity to meet a challenge, we look up and we're reminded that that capacity may well be limitless. This is a time for American heroes. We will do it as hard, we will achieve what is great. This is a time for American heroes, and we reach for the stars." I play the euphonium. It's like a small tuba. Anyway, my professor at Gettysburg is a little bit nuts, but he says some really smart things, and one of them that kept coming back to me as I pondered what to say today. He says, "It's impossible to break a bad habit. We can only start a new, better habit." Too often we, and myself included, get into the bad habit of being cynical, of thinking it doesn't really matter what we do, that the scope of the challenges before us is too great for one person to tackle, so we might as well sit back and wait, or that only the platform or the party for which we vote can possibly address these challenges. I'm convinced that we need to create a new habit, rooted in civility and humility, guided by civic engagement and a willingness to compromise. We need to start sharing ideas, and more importantly, we need to start listening to the ideas of others. It was in that spirit that I wrote my newspaper column. I'm not naive enough to think that newspaper columns and letters to the editor can solve our problems, but I do think that they can start conversations, and it is only those conversations that have a chance to rekindle the values that make America inherently great and set us on a path towards forming the more perfect union our founders envisioned 240 years ago. To that end, modeled after the four-way test and rooted in the Scout Law, I would like to introduce my newly developed one-way test of citizenship. Did my actions and conversations today make America a more perfect union? Our Constitution acknowledges that we will never be a perfect union, and it calls us only to make each day better than the one before. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of a constant refrain from backpacking trips with the Boy Scouts. Put one foot in front of the other, and eventually we'll scale the mountain before us. We may even build some friendships and have some fun along the way. Thank you.